Rome thought it would last forever. Ancient Egypt thought it would last forever. The Maya thought it would last forever. And every single one of them was wrong. But here's the question that keeps historians up at night. What if they didn't just fall? What if they all fell the same way? Because when you actually look at the data, something strange emerges. Civilizations that never met each other, that spoke different languages, worshiped different gods, lived on different continents, they all seem to follow the same invisible script. Almost like there's a hidden rule nobody told them about. A rule they all broke and paid for it with everything. So what is that rule? Let's start with Rome. Because Rome is not just a history lesson, Rome is a warning. At its peak, Rome was the most powerful civilization on Earth. It had the best roads, the best army, the best legal system. It connected more of the world than anything before it. And Romans genuinely believed it would never end. They called it the Eternal City for a reason. But something quietly started to go wrong. And it didn't start with barbarians at the gates. It started with money. Rome had been expanding for centuries, and expansion is expensive. Armies cost money, borders cost money. The bureaucracy that holds an empire together costs a staggering amount of money. And at some point, Rome started running out of it. So Roman emperors made a decision that felt small at the time, but turned out to be catastrophic. They started shaving silver off the edges of their coins, then mixing in cheaper metals, then a little more, then a lot more. What was once a nearly pure silver coin became, over generations, something closer to a copper coin with a thin silver coating. The money itself became a lie, and people noticed. Merchants noticed, soldiers noticed, farmers noticed. When the money stops meaning what it says it means, trust starts to die. Prices rise. People hoard real goods instead of currency. Trade slows. Tax revenue drops. And to make up for the lost revenue, the government raises taxes on the people least able to pay them. Meanwhile, the wealthy and politically connected find ways to avoid those taxes entirely. The burden shifts. The middle class shrinks. The gap widens. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The Roman government didn't get smaller to deal with this crisis. It got bigger. More administrators, more enforcement, more military spending to protect borders that kept getting harder to hold. Rome wasn't conquered. Rome exhausted itself. And the barbarians, they showed up near the end, after the machine had already started to break down from the inside. Now here's where it gets interesting, because if you move 12,000 miles away from Rome, across an ocean, into the dense jungles of Central America, you find the Maya, a civilization that had never heard of Rome, didn't share its language, its religion, its trade routes, or its politics. And yet, when you look at how the Maya collapsed, something deeply uncomfortable becomes visible. The Maya built some of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world. Enormous stone pyramids, advanced astronomy, complex writing systems, elaborate trade networks. At their height, millions of people lived under Maya governance. And then, over the course of roughly a century, the southern lowland cities were almost entirely abandoned. But why? For a long time, historians blamed drought, and drought played a role. But the deeper story is more familiar than it should be. Maya kings, in their competition with each other, began a kind of arms race. Each ruler needed bigger monuments, more elaborate ceremonies, larger palaces than the last. To fund it all, they extracted more and more from the land and from the people working it. The forests got cleared, the soil got depleted. The agricultural system that fed millions began to break down. And at the same time, ordinary Maya people began to lose faith in their rulers. These kings had claimed divine authority. They were supposed to bring rain, to keep the cosmos in order. When the crops failed, that authority cracked. And when authority cracks, the whole structure gets fragile. Then the droughts hit, and a fragile structure doesn't bend, it breaks. Same story, different civilization, different continent, different century. So now let's jump to something even closer to home, the British Empire, the largest empire in human history. At its peak, it controlled roughly a quarter of all land on Earth. The British genuinely believed they had built something permanent, something different from all the empires that came before. They were wrong too. After the First World War, and then the Second, Britain was exhausted. The cost of maintaining a global empire, the military bases, the naval presence, the administrative infrastructure across dozens of countries had become almost impossible to sustain. The debt was staggering. The economy, once the engine of the industrial world, was struggling to compete with newer, faster-moving powers. And yet for years, Britain tried to hold on. Not because holding on made economic sense, but because the identity of being an empire was so deeply embedded in British culture that letting go felt like losing something fundamental about who they were. The empire didn't fall to a conqueror. It was slowly, quietly dismantled, piece by piece, under the weight of what it cost to maintain it. The gap between the image of British power and the reality of British resources became too wide to ignore. Are you starting to see it? Because here's the pattern, and it's almost elegant in how consistent it is. Civilizations rise through a combination of innovation, energy, and relative unity. They build wealth, they build institutions, they build power, and then, almost inevitably, the systems that created the wealth start to be captured by the people at the top of them. The rules that were supposed to apply to everyone start to bend. The gap between the connected and the disconnected grows. The cost of maintaining the whole system keeps rising. And the ordinary people, the farmers, the merchants, the workers, start to feel like the system isn't working for them anymore. Trust erodes. And trust, it turns out, is the actual foundation of civilization. Not the monuments, not the armies, not the laws. Trust. When people stop trusting their money, their institutions, their leaders, the glue holding everything together starts to dissolve. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, then quickly. And this is the hidden rule, the one every collapsed civilization forgot. The greatest threat to a civilization is almost never an outside force. The Visigoths didn't destroy Rome. Rome's internal contradictions did. The Spanish didn't destroy the Maya. Elite competition and resource depletion did. And no single enemy brought down the British Empire. Its own economic weight did. External enemies are almost always the last chapter. Not the cause, the consequence. Which brings us to a question that's uncomfortable to ask out loud. What do you do with this pattern when you look at the modern world? When you notice that trust in institutions across the developed world has been declining for decades, when the gap between the wealthiest and everyone else is wider than it's been in a century, when governments are carrying debt loads that would have seemed unimaginable to previous generations, when the cost of maintaining global influence keeps rising while the economic base strains under the pressure. These aren't political statements. They're historical data points, the same kind of data points that, in hindsight, we now recognize as warning signs in Rome, in the Maya lowlands, in the late British Empire. Nobody is saying collapse is coming. Nobody can know that. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, and human societies have shown a remarkable ability to adapt when they choose to. But the pattern is real, and the pattern doesn't care how powerful you think you are. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that collapse is inevitable, but that every civilization that collapsed believed completely, sincerely, without doubt, that it was the exception. That the forces that had brought down lesser civilizations somehow didn't apply to them. That they had built something too advanced, too sophisticated, too important to fail. Rome believed it. The Maya believed it. The British believed it. And maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous thing any civilization can do is stop asking whether the pattern applies to them, because it always does.